Hello, and welcome to the 79th episode of NEOHUMAN Podcast. I'm a Gabahari Etiologist on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow this show on liveinlimbo.com, iTunes, YouTube, BitChute, and at some point on Spotify. And today with me, I have Brad Templeton. Welcome to NEOHUMAN Podcast, Brad.
Yes, hi, good to be here.
Pleasure to have you. And just to give our audience some kind of a context where your thoughts and opinions are coming from, let's start with your background, the work you've done, the lives you've lived, and what are you mainly focused on now these days?
Oh, you mean I have to do that? It's always much more self-aggrandizing when you have to do that. Usually you get the host to do that. Well, I've done a lot of different things, all pretty much related to computers and high tech, but started out in the software field, wrote a dozen software packages back in the 80s, games and tools and things like that. Got probably, the other two things that made people know me were, one was in the 80s, the internet was growing, and I hosted what would be, considered the first or one of the first blog type things, a publication of comedy that was the most widely read thing on the internet for many years. But then I also started the first .com, the first business on the internet, an electronic newspaper back then, which I built during the 90s. That was started in Waterloo, Ontario, a town you may know, and but I moved it to Silicon Valley. Since then, after selling that, I've been involved in a lot of different ventures and the nonprofit work. I was 20 years at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a civil rights group. It does free speech, privacy, these things in the computer world. Foresight Institute, an organization devoted to nanotechnology and futurist technologies. Went to work on self-driving cars, got very interested in them, got invited to work on Google's self-driving car during its first few years. It's now known as Waymo. Let's see, also helped build a fake university called Singularity University, which tries to help people understand the effects of rapidly changing technology, and did that during the previous decade. And all along, I've been writing and talking and inventing in those fields.
How has the internet world has changed and changed the world since its early days, where you were there, present, right there?
Yeah, not much.
Really?
No, of course. I mean, I don't know how you can ask a question. That's a very broad question. How has the internet changed the world? I mean, it's probably you could say the computer is the most significant invention of recent days because it sits underneath all those. But of the things the computer did, the internet probably changed people's lives more than any of them.
Yeah.
And and one obvious reaction that we're all experiencing right now is that if we had wanted to do a lockdown to stop a disease from spreading, 20 years ago, what we're doing today, everyone working from home, everybody meeting all the time by video calls and so on, that would just not even be possible. So the lockdown wouldn't be possible. It might not be possible to fight that kind of disease. So, that's just one example. Actually, I am one of several who, back in 2005, I wrote an essay saying, a pandemic's going to come, and at least this time, and I outlined all the things we're doing. We'll all be doing classes at home. We'll all be working at home and getting deliveries of everything we order online. And that has happened. Unfortunately, the other things that I predicted or advised didn't happen. So, and not everything changes. But you'll have to get a little more specific with a question like that, I think.
One of the reasons I ask is because this democratization of information seems to have brought a lot of liberty for people, but at the same time have brought a lot of confusion. That some people are making the argument that we've never been this divided, but my argument is that we've probably have always been this divided, but it just hasn't been heard. Now we have channels and access to those channels to be heard and contribute with our ideas, and everybody seems to be basically ringing their own bells.
Well, I think what you say is true to an extent, and I used to say it wholeheartedly. I don't say it so wholeheartedly now. I think that one thing that none of us, so I would say none, I'm sure there were a few, but very few people accounted for, was the extent that propaganda could be a digital weapon. And so that, I think that has changed and is going to get worse. We're seeing that people, countries, nations, and are attempting to use propaganda in an entirely new and different way, targeting people individually, targeting people with just exactly the messages to push their buttons and get them to fight each other more than they would have fought each other in the past. Yes, we've always had differing opinions. Um, we didn't tend to have our own facts so much, and what's become clear is that populations are now isolating where they get their information from, and each source is slanted in particular ways. And it's, mostly people in my community say, "Oh God, it's the right to have this worse," and they're watching Fox News or whatever they're doing. But the truth is, every side is getting its own particular collection of information. It's very hard to try and remove the biases from the media that you consume. And we didn't anticipate that. We anticipated, or at least I anticipated, that you would socialize with your friends online, because I was doing that in the 1980s. In fact, it was one of what I'll call the great realizations of my life. Was back in, this is a long time ago now, back in about 1981. I first got, I'd gotten on the ARPANET in '79, but I got on it for a day-to-day basis a year or two later. And at that time, everyone thought computer networks were for computers to talk to computers and, exchange data, share files, that sort of stuff. And the epiphany was, wow, no, this is for people to talk to people. This is for our communication, and not just for business, but for socialization. And a lot of the things in my career have been based on that epiphany, and everyone else pretty much agrees with it today. But should have seen more of the dark side of that, I guess.
Yeah, I guess they come together, right? The light and darkness.
They always do.
Yeah.
And in fact, the funny thing is, you make this mistake even though you know the truth. But it is a very common and foolish mistake to not look at any new technology and say, okay, what will bad people do with this? And I mean, we always think that, we always ask that question. We're always seeing bad people do things. But I don't know why, but we missed the idea that someone like Vladimir Putin would attempt to, manipulate a country from the outside at a very deep, detailed and inside. Countries have done propaganda, they've done these sort of things, but it was dropping leaflets from airplanes or having radio-free, radio stations. It was not the way it's become.
It's also that the arbitration of good and bad has been democratized in a way that now a mob of people on Twitter can decide who is a bad person based on maybe one comment that person has made 10 years ago, 15 years ago, which brings really big concern that how this whole thing is going to evolve, considering how you mentioned we don't agree on facts anymore, how this world with all this arbitration of good and bad, plus technologies like deep fake that are being easier and easier for people to just make up stuff from ground up, is going to affect this sociopolitical, very fragile sociopolitical dynamic that we're dealing with right now.
Well, you hit two things in there. I'll briefly touch on deepfakes. While they're scary, if you think about it, of course, there's nothing in text which is inherently true. If someone sends you a written article saying something, you know that, anyone could write that. And you have something in your brain that says, I should see whether that's believable, I should see whether that's true. But with video, you don't have that. You sort of think, if I see it, it must be true. And what I'm hoping is that we'll lose that sense, that we'll see a video and we'll say, okay, that's a video, but videos are no more real than text. And at least I hope, because if not, if we start believing everything we see in video is true, we are going to get more riled up. But you touched on, I think, the deeper issue, one that we have not figured our way out of at all, which is, becoming mobs and this very tempting but dangerous vigilante justice, which on the one hand you think, well, hey, that's just people expressing themselves. It's certainly allowed, and it is. But, we actually have centuries of experience where we sort of laid down the principles of justice and how they should work. The idea of people being presumed innocent until they're proven guilty and not being punished until that happens, of metering out punishment to fit the crime and to perform not a retribution role, but a deterrent and a rehabilitation role. Principles of evidence, principles of rights of the accused, rights of everyone involved. And we built those systems of justice over hundreds of years because we saw what goes wrong when you don't apply those principles. Unfortunately, we have now discovered this new way to get not justice but retribution. and we're clearly not being very good about it. And we all feel very satisfied. Ha ha ha! There's that person, and I saw a video where it looks like they were racist, so I'm going to make them lose their job. And I'm not saying people should be racist or we shouldn't be disapproving of people who are racist, but sometimes the penalty is, total annihilation from society for an offhand remark, which is not appropriate meting out of justice. And I don't know actually what's going to be the solution to that.
Now, here's an example with respect to autonomous vehicle. There is the ethical dilemma with respect to autonomous cars that if you come across a crossroad, there is no ethical dilemma. Now, just in this example that I'm trying to make a point out of, that you come across a crossroad and one is blocked, you can kill yourself, for example, and the other has a baby in it or an old man in it. Which one would you choose? Now, if this kind of mob mentality get into a justice system and say that, hey, if you, for example, kill a black person, that is not okay, but if you kill a white person, that would be okay with an autonomous vehicle. Would that be a possibility?
I don't know about that one, but getting back to your question of who the car would run over, that I do have an answer for, which is they're keeping track of who asks that question, and they're going to run over the people who ask that question. That is the plan. The reality is, does this happen to you a lot? Have you often been driving and had to decide whether to kill yourself or a baby?
No, not at all.
Have you ever heard of it happening to someone else?
No, I've read a lot of arguments about it, though. Yeah,
it is not a real thing. It's like it's a what it is it's a morbid fascination that we have with the idea of a machine deciding who lives and who dies. So for us, that used to be for gods, not even for people to decide. And so as soon as you start saying, what if a machine is deciding who lives and who dies, everyone goes, oh, wow, that's like deep. Oh, got to figure that out. And in fact, no, it's an extremely rare situation. I've been looking around, and I can't say I've never found an instance where something like that happened, but it's just not the kind of thing that's anywhere on anyone's priority list about what to program a car to do. And secondly, there's almost always already an answer in the law about where a car should go, because the law is actually full of 1,000 rules about where the car can go and who has right of way and who's supposed to yield. And so the car will first and foremost obey the law. So, it's long time before anyone will have to imagine a car having to make that decision. And so the fact that worrying about it is actually the ethical problem, because if you spend a lot of time worrying about that, you're not worrying about the things that actually matter and might actually save people's lives.
What are some of the more important factors and elements that matter with respect to autonomous vehicles?
Well, I mean, everyone is set on a goal of making the car so that it's safe enough on the roads to be accepted by the public and to not create great liability for the people who put it out there. There's actually nothing. I mean, there are moral concerns going on, but in fact, there's just very practical concerns, which is the first, you've got to build a car that you can prove to yourself is safe enough to put out there. You actually, that's the first people you have to convince, is that you yourselves have done it. You have to convince your lawyers, your company's board of directors, that it's time to put this vehicle out on the road. So that's the challenge everyone's working for, is how can they make it safe enough that we feel comfortable doing it? Obviously, you want the public to feel comfortable with it as well. Right now, you don't actually have to make the government feel comfortable with it. Someday you might have to, but here's a little dark secret no one seems to know. It's already illegal to hit people. We don't actually need another law that say that. We've got that law down there. It's probably the most tested law in the world. There's no tort that's more common in courts than a car accident. Actually, it's not in the courts that much because it's in insurance companies, but effectively in that sense. So that's what you got to do. And so now, of course, that breaks down into a lot of different problems. Right now, if you were to ask people, what's your hardest problem that you're working on? I think a lot of them would say, we want to get the computer better at predicting what humans will do. So you're driving down the road. Is that car going to suddenly change lanes? Is that guy going to step into the crosswalk? This is something that humans are better than computers at predicting, what other humans are thinking. So that'd be the one thing that people are sort of pushing on. And people are working on all the other problems as well, making sure that you see and understand everything in the road, that you can handle as lots and lots of unusual situations. These are key problems everyone is always trying to improve on. eventually, and people argue about what level of safety they want to achieve, most people sort of dance around the idea of let's make it better than the average person. Um, and I don't think that's an unreasonable goal. Some people want to be much better than the average person. I don't actually think that's the right path. I think perfection is certainly not attainable and therefore not the right goal to go for. Um, I even think there are arguments that you could make it just as good as a teenager with a freshly minted driver's license. Now, people would say that's not very safe, but we certainly allow that on the road, and we do it because that's how we turn those teenagers into more mature, better drivers. But the one trick is that when we make a teenager better with a driving course or some experience, we only make one teenager better. If we let robots go out there and get their experience and improve, we make all the robots better at the same time, at least all the ones from the same company.
Yeah, on the social level, it just seems to me that people's immediate problem with machines is that they're going to replace humans, whether it's labor or decision making or anything like that. And then a lot of arguments are being made using or maybe taking advantage of that concern, coming from the side that they're fundamentally against automation, against autonomous vehicles. They make the ethical or moral kind of an argument, right?
Yeah, it's reasonable to worry about that. I think some of that worry is not justified. I think some of it is. So far, the history of machines replacing humans is actually not nearly as scary as people imagined back in the Industrial Revolution. In fact, a famous statistic which astounds people is that there are more bank tellers today than in 1970. And if you were to say, name me a job where the machine replaced a human, everyone would say, well, bank teller, I don't go in and get cash from the human being anymore. Those bank tellers aren't handing you cash anymore, of course. They're doing other things. But in fact, we actually haven't done that much. Now, will that change? But we've predicted that machines will take all the jobs for 150 years. With every 10 years, a big nasty book will come out warning how, oh my God, the machines are going to take all the jobs. And guess what? It's wrong every time. Now, is it someday going to be right? Maybe. And should we think about it? Sure, we should think about it. But we should also understand why we're always wrong when we make the prediction and try and figure out how we can tell that, oh, this is the time where we're no longer always wrong. This is the time where it really happens. Now, when it comes to driving, well, we got two kinds of people making their living from driving. We do have, all the Uber cab drivers, that sort of thing in the world. And I don't want to deprecate these people, but the truth is they don't think of that as a career. They didn't, when they were little kids, say, I want to grow up and be a cab driver, right? They do that because it's kind of handy gig work. They can set the hours. It doesn't take a lot of skill. You basically can go out there and work when you want, and you've got a car and you make some money. And I think that those people will go and do something else like that if driving isn't that great a way to make money with it. Sure, Uber and Lyft and those companies discovered a way that people could make money that way, and they enabled a lot of people to make money that way. But that didn't even exist 11 years ago. So cab driving existed, but it was a much smaller profession. Then there's professional truck drivers. Those are real. There's about 3 million of those in the United States. Now, in the professional truck driving industry, and long-haul driving in particular, the turnover every year is often more than 100%. Literally, that more people leave the job than there are jobs, so that they last less than a year in the job. That's what it means. You think, how could it be more than 100%? It's because
they just don't want to do it, right?
It's grueling work.
Yeah.
If you do it long haul, you basically have to go out and for a week of sleeping in motels in the back of your truck. You don't see your family. It's both boring and scary at the same time. And and it pays okay than most other jobs of that skill level because it only takes a month or so to get the training. But no. So when they start driving the trucks, which they will. They're not going to put anybody out of work at first. They're going to just replace the truck driving jobs that are sitting open, which is a lot of them. Eventually, they might sit and go after some of those career truck drivers. And I do feel, it would be good to have some alternatives for them, find some outs. Maybe the government can do that. Maybe the companies can even do it. But among all the jobs that people will find replaced by machines, these ones, this is not a great answer if you're in them, but these ones are not the top of the list of ones that people will worry about.
Yeah, people also are very worried about the manufacturing jobs, and that is being misused or used or whatever you want to call it for political purposes all across board.
Manufacturing jobs weren't taken by robots. Manufacturing jobs were taken by cheaper workers.
China.
Uh, oh, not just, yeah, China, other countries, Philippines,
Right.
Southeast Asia is the place right now. People used to think Japan was the place with the cheap workers. Of course, Japan very quickly didn't have cheap workers. And people in India, Pakistan, they're anywhere that, especially advantage there, they speak English, so help them do jobs for the Western world. Um, anyway, yes, that's going to continue. There's going to be labor disruption. I don't think anyone can alter that. But let me give you two ways of thinking about machines doing human tasks, which is that many people have published studies and they say, we calculate that machines are ripe. They don't do it yet, but they're ripe to do like a third of the tasks that human beings do. And some people get that and they respond by saying, oh my God, the computer's going to take my job. What am I going to do? I must admit that I respond to it a different way, saying, when can I get that? Fantastic. I don't want to do all those stupid, boring things I have to do.
Mm-hmm.
If the computer could do that for me, sign me up. And it's really a mix of both for most people. And what's actually happened in the past in all the jobs is that the computer has done some of the boring or dangerous parts of it, and the human beings have done the rest. And employment has, not counting coronavirus panics, employment has grown and was until recently higher than it had ever been in history. And it wasn't the credit of Donald Trump, he likes to pretend it was. It was the march of progress that's actually made more and more jobs. 100 years ago, half of the population worked in agriculture, farming. And now about 2 or 3% of the population work in agriculture or farming. So all those jobs disappeared. Half the jobs in the world went away, and now more people are working than ever.
Right. New jobs were created because of the technological revolution.
Some brand new jobs were created, but actually most of those people are working in jobs that existed in some form or another, but they're doing them in different ways. Like bank teller. Bank tellers are not handing you cash anymore, right? They're doing other parts of the banking job. So
let me read you a question that one of our readers and previous guest, Fritz Harold from Ontario. You're from Canada originally, right?
I am from Ontario, indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. I lived there 11 years in Toronto. He's wondering about your take on the long-term consequences of separating humans from the actual activity they're doing, given we are the outcome of a long evolutionary process, and this technological concentric distancing from an activity we are actually responsible for might have unexpected outcomes. And then he's using the Airbus's fly-by-wire computer-controlled flight that left pilots unable to fly Boeing's computer-assisted aircraft safely, which he thinks were part of the MCAS mishaps in addition to poor design decisions. He has another part to his question, but maybe you answer this one first.
Well, yeah, I don't want to be too critical, but that question seemed to dance around a lot of different things, so I'm not sure what specific thing he wants to get at, but I'll talk about a little bit about the Boeing aircraft. I mean, it was Airbus, of course, that pioneered the idea of making aircraft be fly-by-wire. At the time that they were founded, everyone said, you're crazy, we can't make an aircraft that way. And they did, and they were very successful. And Boeing was, of course, the company that did not pioneer that. And their decision with the 737 MAX was actually, I thought it very different from that. They wanted to make another vehicle that they could say was the same. The 737, one of the most popular aircraft in the world. Every airline has a lot of them. Every pilot in the world is trained to fly the 737. And what they hoped is they could make a 737 with bigger engines and newer, more efficient engines, and make it so that any pilot could fly it who knew how to fly the 737. That was what they hoped to do. And that's what they got wrong. They figured the way to do that, since they built actually a different aircraft, which wouldn't fly the same as a 737, and they tried to make it fly as a 737 by using the software system, which is not entirely a wrong thing to try to do, but they just didn't do it very well. And there were some areas where they didn't test it properly, and it goofed up. And then the pilots were not trained on how to deal with it, because that was the whole point of the 737 MAX. No new training, but very little new training needed for a 737 pilot to take the wings. It turns out there should have been more training, and so some pilots didn't understand what was going on. By the way, there were pilots who had that happen to them, and they dealt with it because they were more experienced pilots. And so anyway, and of course, catastrophic for Boeing. the rest of the question rambled a little bit, so I wasn't entirely
I
sure
think
where
the
it was.
soul of his question goes back to what you said, how human drivers are still better than machines. And he's talking about the unseen consequences of replacing, let's say, human drivers we have evolved decades learning how to drive a car and watching our parents drive a car and seeing other drivers, and this whole thing being replaced by the machines, basically.
Well, so that is actually an answer we're given the other direction by some of the, for example, Waymo, the company that I worked for in its early days.
Google's.
Yeah, it was Google at the time. They have now been out there driving and testing their software. Well, I don't know what the most recent number they published, but I think it was around 20 million miles of real road driving. So that's about 40 human lifetimes of experience in the sense that when anything unusual happens, so these cars are out there driving themselves, but they have people in them. The people are making note if anything weird goes on. They take over if they think there's a chance the software is going to not do the right thing. And so their safety record is excellent. They've had only one very slow crash that took place where it was the fault of the computer. And by the way, so there's never been a case of human being driving for 40 lifetimes. Well, no one drives for 40 lifetimes, but human beings are not nearly that good that they could drive for 40 lifetimes and never, and only once have fault for a crash. Now that's with the supervision. It's more like student drivers with a driving instructor sitting next to them ready to grab the wheel. And so that's one reason they don't have the accidents. But anyway, they've been doing that. And so they think they have seen more than any person could ever see. In addition, by the way, they then have the car drive around in simulator, a little video game basically. And they've driven billions and billions and billions of miles. And by the way, none of the miles they drive in simulator are boring. They don't have it simulate driving on the freeway for an hour, which is what humans have for most of our experience. It spends that hour going through 100 different crash situations and 200 strange other situations, testing that it's going to do the right thing. So actually, there's a fair claim that these systems are far more experienced at driving than we are. What they don't have, they have experience. What they don't have is, the high-level human thought and intuition, which can solve problems never seen before. So the answer to that is they feel. Now, people can argue whether this is true or not. But if you just pound at it long enough and you drive for 20 million miles or some other amount like that and do all these tests, you reduce the probability of something you've never seen before happening. You get it down to the point where you are seeing new things, but you're handling them correctly. And if we don't handle one correctly, then you get very upset and you try and fix it. And you find yourself getting to a level where that bad incident, where something new happens and you don't handle it correctly and there's a crash, is so rare that you're better than people. And if you get to that level, which Waymo claims they are already at least in the simple driving environment near Phoenix, where they have an operating passenger service where vehicles are running around. Not right now with the virus, but generally we're out running around with nobody in them, picking up passengers, taking them across town. So you can do that once you've got to that level, and then you get even better and you release it out to the world.
Waymo is the same company that they partnered with Walmart for driverless trucks.
They do have I believe a small partnership with Walmart doing deliveries. I think Walmart's done one or two partnerships. But yes, they are also making trucks as well. That's correct.
Do you think laws and regulations are in a way obstacles in the way of technological progress? I think I read somewhere that the first car, when it came out in late 19th century, it was 15 years later that they placed the first stop sign.
Well, that would make sense. I mean, there were no roads for cars back when those first cars arose, and there were no gas stations. And there's the famous story, actually, of Bertha Benz, the wife of Carl Benz, who, of course, built the first commercial motorwagen. And Bertha, it's maybe exaggerated, but the story is she kind of snuck off with it and drove for about 60 miles to another German town. And she had to stop at a drugstore, which actually had a supply of benzene. There were no stations, of course, for this. And it was all back dirt roads and so on. So she did the first road trip, including having to fix the vehicle on the way. So a pioneer in her own way. And it certainly was a long time. It took a while for, I don't know if it was the law. I mean, there were a few rare cases. It's not as common as people imagine. But there were a few cases of very strange laws from people scared of the car. The funny story is that when the car did arrive, actually the first cars were electric, but pretty quickly they switched to running on benzene gasoline. Um, that the first cars to, or when cars started arriving in New York City, everyone praised them as, oh my God, we're going to end pollution with these. And the reason they said that was the roads were full of a different kind of pollution from the thing that we used before cars. Yeah, no, they were the roads were deep in horseshit. It was an actual big problem, and yes, these things made a few bad smells in the air, but nothing compared to the horses. And so people were very happy about that.
Yeah, this dynamic between regulations and technology today, though, because the way that you talk about it, and I totally agree with it, that automating driving, maybe it is an ethical choice, that it can be made an argument because of it, that it will cause less accidents. It's better eventually than human drivers, but there will be lawmakers who are paid, especially in the United States, lobbied by car companies, let's say, or a variety of special interests and lobbyists who are placing obstacles on the way of this progress.
To an extent, actually, though, because the car companies, at least until recently, and still to a large extent, they want to win this technology fight. They're trying to build these vehicles. They're scared of the startups being more nimble than they are, smarter than them, but they won't admit that. So they're mostly for it. Although it doesn't mean that they wouldn't mind if it went a little bit slower and if it was a little bit harder for new companies to get in the game and for big companies to continue to win. But other than that, the people we've got trying to do this, though, are Google and Apple, and Ford and General Motors. Frankly, when those companies want something, I think it'll happen. I think that they have much more lobbying power than anyone else. Now, nonetheless, there's certainly legal efforts to slow things down. And as I've said, I think it's already illegal to not drive safely on the roads. And so those laws. And the truth is, all the companies are very afraid not just of the legal consequences of them hitting something, but we saw that Uber, of course, did completely screw up what they were doing. They did run someone over. And that shut down their project, a project they had named was central to the success of their company, and it shut down. And they have a couple of test cars out now, and this is years later now. It's 2 years later now. Everyone stopped because of the pandemic, but everyone realizes that they're investing billions in this thing, and if they make a mistake like that, it could just wipe it all out. And so they're very strongly motivated to not make such a mistake. Obviously, in the case of Uber, not strongly enough. And that is a long story we can get into if you want, but because
sure.
In fact, I've probably studied that more than anybody outside of Uber or the NTSB. And and it was in the end, it was human error, but human error caused by management decisions, poor management decisions.
This is Uber.
Yeah, the Uber fatality. Now, I mean, obviously the software in the Uber car was not good enough to drive the roads. That's pretty clear. But that's not a mistake in the sense that all of the cars, when they're prototypes, go out there unable to drive. And I have been in the Google car when it, started acting erratically and I had to take the wheel. Every single vehicle, no matter what the quality of the team making it, goes through periods where it's necessary for the human being inside of it to take the wheel and stop it from hitting something. Fortunately, very rarely a person, but in some cases, there have been many incidents where someone had to take the wheel to stop what might have been an accident that hurt somebody. So that's normal. That's part of the game. And as I said, they've gone for this 40 human lifetimes without hitting anybody, so it works if you do it well. But it doesn't guarantee that people will do it well. Uber hired obviously a very poor choice of person to supervise the vehicle. To make it worse, everybody uses 2 people to supervise the vehicle, and they decided to go to just 1 for reasons that are still debated. And the person they hired paid no attention to her job and started watching a streaming show on her phone. And so, yeah, if your job is to watch the road and you're watching a streaming show on your phone, people can get hurt. And that is tragic, but it is sadly not too remarkable,
right?
In terms of telling us that the robots are dangerous. I mean, I won't say there's no lessons to be learned for how to operate robots. There are lessons to be learned, and Uber and other people did learn them. But everyone also learned a lesson that they all knew, which is you cannot play it fast and loose the way that Uber did, because it can mean the end of everything you're trying to do.
What you said about Google also reminded me of Google Glass. That when it came out, it was so cutting edge, and we were all like, "This is what we want to get." It's like a very obvious step towards becoming a cyborg. But people started attacking a lot of people who were wearing Google Glasses around San Francisco area, that they filmed it, whether it was because they were threatened because of privacy reasons, or because they were threatened because, hey, you think you're better than me or something like that. And that kind of shut it down for, I don't know. I know that they're still around, but not in the mainstream way.
My doctor is always wearing one when I go to the doctor. And he says, I have to ask if it's okay to use this. And I say, well, I helped build it, so I'm probably okay with it. Now, I helped in a very, very tiny way. I was working at Google X on the car, and Glass was the second project of Google X, so I sat with those people and, contributed very tiny amounts to what they did. So no, I mean, Glass was just a product that was, both too early and aimed a little bit wrong, as happens when you're too early. And I don't think there's any giant lesson from that. There are lessons, to be sure. The lesson, as I make in a humorous way, is that Glass was designed to be super lightweight. They wanted it to be really light and small, and especially for that day. I think there's people who've done even better, years since, but at the time it was a remarkable engineering achievement to make it so light and small. And the goal, in fact, was to make it so light that you would forget you had it on, which you could. I wore it from time to time, and I would forget it was on there. I'd even go to into the bathroom with it on. I'd realize now probably that's not a cool thing to do. But the joke was that nobody else forgot you had it on. Anyone who looked at you said, "Oh, he's got that super geeky thing on his head." One of the design factors was it was asymmetrical. It was only on one side of your head. The human eye is very noticing of that. So nobody knows, so people just weren't very accepting of it. It couldn't do very much because it was limited by how much power it would take to do things. It had to run on a very small battery that fit in the arm of an eyeglass, or a little box behind your ear. And I don't think we've actually figured out the exact answer for how we would want to wear a computer. Well, I don't have it on right now, but I guess so. I have a smartwatch that I wear some of the time. I actually think the watch is a better form factor for these sort of things. The watch doesn't take video because it's not up in a place to do so. I see you're wearing a kind of amulet. I actually think that wouldn't be a bad form factor. What have you got there? It's yeah.
These two have been brought for me by my girlfriend from Hawaii. But
yeah, and of course you're wearing it as art.
Yes, but I'm all in favor of, if there will be a contact lens, or Elon Musk Neuralink, by the time it's in third, fourth generation, that you can somehow rely on it, that it's not gonna, it's not the first generation. I'm all in favor of it, because I think this is actually not a new process that we are merging with the machines. It's just becoming seamless.
Well, so the goal with Glass was not to merge with machines by any stretch. What they wanted to see happened with Glass, and unfortunately it wasn't as exciting as they wanted it to be, but they wanted to see what happened with what if a computer or the network was just really super available with very little effort, very little time. Now obviously everyone's already got a phone in their pocket, so you'd think, boy, isn't computing very available to you? And it is. But reaching into your pocket, pulling out a phone, unlocking it, finding the app you want to run, running the app, getting an answer, that is comparatively a lot to just having something in front of your eyes that you can just look at and see. So anyway, so the answer was, it wasn't as exciting. For people who need to work hands-free, like the doctor, there's people like that using devices like Google Glass today, and it's reasonably successful with them. But will it be in a watch? Will it be in a pendant? Will it be in a contact lens? Sure, but we don't know how to make. We don't have the technology yet to make a contact lens to do what we need to do there, other than to also have glasses with it to send the power to it, because there's no way to store power in a contact lens. You got to transmit the power safely to it. And will it be an implant in the brain? Well, again, lots of experimentation going on there, but very, very primitive right now. Maybe someday it will be less primitive.
Including Neuralink.
Neuralink doesn't say a lot about what they're doing, so I can't really, comment on it only in a very speculative way. Um, but actually, I'll tell you the one thing about things like Neuralink, which makes it such a hard problem, is we've already got this massive channel into the brain right here, and to beat the ability of this thing to get information into the brain, I mean, that's not happening for a long time.
Hmm.
I mean, the eye and the ear are obviously evolved to be this, but they're extremely high bandwidth information channels, which we're very tuned to work with. So you toss a chip in your brain with 1,000 electrodes, and yeah, you might be able to do some cool stuff, but you're nothing compared to the eye.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on merging with machines in general? You're involved in Singularity University. Ray Kurzweil has the date 2045 for Singularity.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you should never name dates. That's a bad thing. And whatever. Of course, people have many different definitions of what a singularity is. Actually, Werner Vinci, who was the person who coined the term and who I've known for many years, I published one of his books in ebook form back, good Lord, almost 30 years ago. He eventually said that the idea of a singularity was actually like a mathematical singularity, a metaphor for it as a point that it's undefined, that you cannot predict beyond, that it's you don't have the equipment to predict what it means. So, which means it's some kind of pointless to talk about what it means because you are not equipped to do it. Maybe future you will be equipped to do it. And then more specifically, of course, of computer intelligence becoming so smart that it surpasses humans, and that among the things it surpasses humans at is programming new intelligence so that it is also better at making its own descendants. And that this could then happen so quickly that you quickly leave the abilities of humans behind. It's very hard to predict when that would happen or if that would happen. But yes, we are going to get closer and closer machines. And I do believe it is obviously possible to have intelligence in a machine, because if you can have it in a sort of a wet tank of proteins inside bone, I'm pretty sure you can have it in other things. I mean, there's nothing magical about our brains. Some people are trying to imagine, the brain has some mystical ability to hold intelligence. Well, obviously religions believe that. Religions believe that there's something outside the brain, a soul bestowed from God or whoever is the origin of those things. But if you're not taking that approach, then there's nothing magical about the brain. And so clearly that's not the only way that intelligence could exist. And so eventually we will make one. I mean, we make intelligences all the time. Any man and woman can do it with things they have around the house. But we are not aware of how we do it. It just evolved. But it's obviously possible to do it. When we will understand how to do it is a less answered question. But we keep seeing glimpses that we're getting closer to that. But I'm not going to go so far as to agree with Ray's prediction.
Very interesting perspective. I've never heard the bone and the like if we can create intelligence with our structure, we certainly can. It can be done within machines. That's a very interesting comparison.
But we do it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
unless you believe in the mystical soul coming into the body, it is entirely the act of humans which makes more humans and more intelligences.
Well, mystical soul is just an attempt to answer the unanswerable, basically, right? Our attempt that we know what's going on.
It's a lot of things. It is for many people, though, a strong desire to feel that we are more than flesh and bone. Okay, some people feel that, and then they sense that they look at the world and they say it has to be more than flesh and bone. Other people, feel they've had a religious experience to tell them that. And so there are many people who think that. And there are other people, and I'm one of them, who look at it and say, actually, I think it's freaking amazing that you can have intelligence from just it's not, they say, oh, God is wondrous and amazing. I'm saying it's wondrous and amazing that evolution could produce something like us. And Einstein, though he was a religious man, said a great thing. He said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. That the remarkable thing is that something as amazing as the universe, and of course it's amazing, and many people say that's proof of God, is that the universe is so amazing. But The fact that the workings of the universe can at some level be understood inside the brain of a piece of the universe. That's what Einstein was marveling at, and I marvel at it with him.
Yeah, I totally agree. The God term, I've talked about it with a number of people, mathematicians, philosophers, technologists. It means nothing when people are saying it. They don't even know what it means. They just throw it out there to basically fill a gap of the unknown.
I'm not going to go that harsh. I mean, there are people who devote their lives to it. My father, before I was born, devoted his life to it. He became an agnostic. But
The
so
Christian
no,
version of a God.
the Christian version. He was of Christian, but there are people from all kinds of faiths and many people who devoted themselves. Now, there is a cynical but very rational explanation for it, that the brain does seem to be a little bit primed to feel a spiritual connection. And they've found, for example, there's areas in the brain that you can stimulate that cause people to have a religious experience. Um, so that they actually feel they've got direct contact with something spiritual. And having directly experienced that, then it is not surprising that they believe it.
Do you think machines could have a similar kind of an experience?
Yes. I mean, I don't think they'd have a part of the machine that you can stick electrodes in and it starts seeing God. Humans seem to have that. Some would argue, God put that there. Well, who knows?
But there should be a need for it, right?
Well, I believe that we are machines. And in the full formal definition of a machine, obviously, we're not gears and oil. And so, of course, machines can have spiritual experiences because we are machines and we have them. And machines that think as we do or think better than we do, of course, should be able to understand what spiritual means. And now, would they actually have the spiritual experience that comes to us because of what some might call a flaw in our brains? They could be designed to. I'm not sure I would design one that way, but someone else might.
Fair enough.
But would they be able to understand the things that we talk about when we talk about spirituality? I would have to believe so if they are as smart as we are.
Yeah, and let me just mention this. When I said about God and people, I don't mean to offend anybody. I guess can be considered a spiritual person in my own way, but my argument was that objectively speaking, it's impossible to come up with kind of a definition that you would have everybody agreed upon, because a Muslim God is very different than a Christian God, than a whatever higher being that Hindus believe in, for example. And majority of people in the world, they don't believe in any specific version of a God.
Well, let me go more specific than this, though. I will tell you that I'm one of the people who believes that it is not out of the question that the first machine intelligences would be copied from human brains. And this has become something the public's a little more aware of because Amazon recently released a TV series called Upload, where that's a central plot element. This concept has been around in fiction and in speculation for many decades. And the idea is that while we do not understand how intelligence works or how the brain works, it's not impossible that first we'll understand how it works at the low level and simply copy the pattern that we don't understand, but we can copy. Some people argue whether we can copy it or not, but people here are positing that you could copy it into a non-bag of protein form, it wouldn't be a digital computer, but it would be some kind of electronic form, for example. And that you would have then that human mind inside the silicon. And that would be both an artificial brain and a natural intelligence and of course, as a copy of you or I or anyone else, it could certainly believe in God and talk to you about God all day exactly the same way the human that he or she was copied from could.
Mm-hmm. Let me read you the second part of the question that I read, that how will the insurance business appropriate fault in a computer-controlled car? Would it be the driver, the car maker, the software engineer? Who would it be?
Funny, because I just literally a few minutes ago came from a planning session for a debate that we'll be having online tomorrow on insurance and self-driving cars. And I've actually spoken about that a lot.
Where would that debate be?
It'll be, of course, virtual.
Like at what website or?
It'll be at this website called zoom-tank.com. I'm not actually in this particular debate. I'm usually in it, but I'm in the planning committee. So the answer is bad for the insurance companies, which is that I don't think they actually have a role here. Now, your friend is asking a question which a lot of people ask. They just want to know who's at fault. And the answer that's always been very obvious, which is to say that, first of all, the computer makes a complete recording of anything that happened in 3 dimensions, a recording far beyond any recording you've ever seen. So in terms of who broke the law and who was at fault under the vehicle codes and so on, that will be known within seconds. Look at the recording, you'll say, okay, this guy did that guy did that. So in terms of legal fault, that will be super simple and trivial. And so if the software made a mistake, the people who made or run the software will obviously be liable for it. And no one's ever doubted that. In fact, so much of people never doubted that most of the major companies, including Google, Volvo, Mercedes, all the big car companies, not all of them, but most of them, have declared in advance, of course, we will be responsible if our car crashes and it's the fault of the car software. We're not responsible if you run into it, but if it runs into something, they're at fault. And how could it be any other way? Would you get into an Uber if you had to sign a thing saying, if this Uber driver crashes, I have to pay? Of course not. You're not going to get into that car. So of course they have to accept the responsibility for it. So that a lot of people think, like, I hear that question a lot, and it surprises me because to me, and I think to many other people, the answer has been very straightforward.
Are you familiar with Defense Distributed?
You mean Cody?
Cody Wilson.
Cody Wilson. Yes, I've met him. Interesting character.
How do you see this lawsuit and the whole being able to print guns from the perspective of free speech and civil rights, especially since you basically were at the top of electronic, what is that, EFF?
Electronic Frontier Foundation. Yes, we did a lawsuit over many years to get the courts to declare, as they did, that software is a form of expression, and therefore protected by laws of free speech. And so, the same applies to his files, I would have to say, even though they're even scarier, I guess, to people, because he can make parts for guns, or you can make parts for guns with a 3D printer. So I'm not surprised it scares people. I'm not surprised people are going after him. But if you wanted to imagine a world where there are illegal files with things that must not be known, that's a pretty scary world.
Yeah, it is speech, though, right?
It is. Yeah. I mean, I think we got the court to. So I shouldn't say obviously, because we did have to get a court to rule on that and have an 8-year fight. But to us, of course, the case was pretty clear.
Yeah. I thought the genius of him was just blurring the line between the Second Amendment and the First Amendment in such a meaningful way. I read his book too. It's not like he's right or left, and I think this is beyond any kind of a political affiliation.
Well, as a Canadian, you're probably not as much of a fan of the Second Amendment as most Americans are.
I'm a huge fan of Second Amendment because I'm coming from revolutionary Iran. And I know that they distributed guns among the revolutionaries to take over the government. And the first thing they did after the revolution succeeded was like, okay, we're recalling all the guns. The state has a monopoly on violence.
Yeah, no. I mean, if you're in obviously a dire situation, as was the case in Iran, but either during the Shah or later during the revolutionary government, there's a reason why you want the public to defend themselves. And in Canada, actually, of course, there's huge ownership of rifles among the population. People think Canadians don't have guns. No, we have lots of rifles. What we don't have is handguns. And it is clear that handguns are responsible for a significant increase in gun deaths in the United States. I mean, the numbers are just staggering. So anyway, but whether you're a fan of the Second Amendment or not, people come to the defense of Cody Wilson because strictly for the First Amendment question.
Yeah. All right, this was a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. Let me ask you the last question I ask all my guests, that if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done? And what would you say is our greatest achievement?
Well, of course, the intelligent alien already knows this in any real situation, because any intelligent alien we're going to come across has got significantly greater capabilities than we have. What is the worst and best thing that humans have done? I mean, I guess my answer on the worst thing is kind of boring, right? It's atrocity. It's the long history of atrocity that we have. It's the long history of like what happened. We study forever what happened in Germany and various other cases, but to many ways, you look at Rwanda, which happened in the modern world, where we know the example of Germany, and where you look at the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where again we knew that example and it was modern times, and it didn't take very much to pull away the veil, and people would come out with their machetes, right, in Rwanda. So the fact that, and the fact that, by the way, Germans aren't really worse than us, right? We imagine, okay, oh yeah, well, the Germans were just, they were all internal Nazis, and so they did these horrible things. No, they were people not too different from the people today.
Yeah, people think it can be replicated here and repeated here in the U.S.
So yeah, that is still true, as I would say is one of the things I think is the worst of us. The best of us is what Einstein said, that we have managed to actually get closer and closer to an understanding of the way the universe works. That we're a piece of the universe, and we keep doing that. And we came up with science. We came up with a way to actually make reliable information that we could test and repeat until it actually seemed like we had confidence it was true, and that all of us know is true because we bet our lives on the truth of scientific principles every day, everywhere we go, and except when we're staying at home all day. Now we don't bet our lives on science every day. Well, we still bet it on the food we eat is assured through these principles that we've devised. So that grand achievement is the best of man.